Hi, my name is Tom Deegan, and I'd like to welcome you to Oklahoma School Budgeting Simplified. This is part of two videos. This is part two of two videos about Oklahoma school finance to kind of simplify it for everybody. This focuses on the budgeting and the expenditure side. The other one focuses on the revenue, where you receive your money. And if you didn't have a chance to join me for that video, let's do just a quick review. The concept of that is all school funding in the United States is based on the concept of equity. Like it, love it, leave it, or hate it. This is not the politicized version. This is just the concept that state and school funding on the federal and the state level is based on the concept of making sure kids, students, groups of students are funded similarly in different districts no matter where they live. And that's the concept of it when it comes to school finance. And that's what all of it's based on. And in the last video, we talked about these two things when it comes to school revenue. And it's important to understand these when it comes to budgeting as well. There are two opposing federal mindsets that you've got to be aware of. And Title I is the funding and making sure groups of students are funded equitably or similarly. Now, you'll see this on the state level in concepts like transportation indexes, which means if you're a very isolated district, you'll receive more funding because it costs more money to get your kids to school on school buses. And on the SPED or the special ed, this concept, if a student needs a wheelchair, that student is going to require more resources to be educated. That concept also permeates the state level funding and concepts like gifted and talented as well. If you understand that we have two groups, we have two mindsets when it comes to equity, focusing on groups of children or individual children, then the three rules of state finance make sense. They're very simple. More kids, more money. More difficult to educate, more money. And number three, which charters don't have to worry about in the state of Oklahoma, more local funding, the less state funding you're provided. That's your gross production. That's your ad valorem. Those are what you're called chargeables. So if you're superintendent or you hear that term, we're talking about chargeables. And that means the state won't let you receive, it's possible you'll receive no state money because your local district has so many rich local resources. So that's the understanding of the concept of revenue. And I've understand those three rules and those two mindsets. If you understand that, you can really break down school finance. I've taught school finance in Texas, Oklahoma, and actually had students from other parts of the nation as well. I found these rules to be solid and constant, and as well as these expenditures and budgeting. So if you're trying to understand school finance, new superintendent, new administrator, or just a board member, or if you're trying to teach it, help people understand it in your classes, for example, please, I hope these rules stand up the test of time. Now, when it comes to budgeting and expenditure, can be frustrating. You can understand where the revenue comes from, but you've got to understand how to spend it and make sure that you're doing some certain things. For example, number one, you've got to make sure you have accurate counting and reporting. That matters greatly. That means knowing your kids. For example, you receive a different weight for a pre-K child, means you receive more funding for that child than you do a sixth grade student. And that is important. So you want to make sure they're categorized correctly. Gifted and talented, English language learners, Title I, special ed. That's a big deal. In some districts, you just got to make sure every year you have a system to look at that. Number two, you got to understand that most funds or a lot of funds in education are pot in, pot out. We'll use this Title I funding. You receive Title I funding, and you have to spend Title I funding on Title I kids. Special ed funding on special ed kids, gifted and talented, likewise. Not all funds in education are pot in, pot out. I call this Pooh Bear school finance, actually, but many are. So be aware of that. If you're a board member or superintendent, it's one question: is this a pot in, pot out, or can I spend this money pretty broadly? Number three, personnel are your largest expense. Now, a lot of districts will say, well, we're at 85% personnel, but sometimes they forget their contracted services, their plumbers, their speech pathologists, the people that you've had to hire a contract with, even though they're not on the payroll. Some places that'll add up to be 90, 93% when you figure all the people that actually work for you. This is a big concept for board members. It's frustrating because most of your funds, especially if you're a new board member, the majority of your funds are obligated before the first day of school. You get a new superintendent, he or she sits down in the seat. August, most of the money's been spent. It's going to take a year before that superintendent can craft his or her own budget. And therefore, number five comes into play. If you want to have discretionary funds, in some places it's just 2 or 3%. They're very limited without some planning. So if you want different decisions made with your money, you have to think a year, or sometimes years ahead. Now, when it comes to kind of key financial reports, we have raw reports and we have weighted reports. Remember, the rule number one is make sure you have your kids counted. We have raw reports. These are just counting the number of kids. They talk about average daily membership, transportation, etc. Usually they come mainly in the state of Oklahoma through your ASR, your annual statistical report, which is your July allocations are based on your year-end counts, and your first quarter statistical report, and this is where you get your midterm adjustments. So sometimes you get a bonus because you've grown. Now, the weighted reports, this is where you'll receive extra money for a gift and a talent, EL, economically disadvantaged, Title I, SPED. There are also other weights that you get for teacher index, isolation, and grade weights. So they kind of, if you understand that there are some reports, and this is just a matter of being aware, they impact your funding. That's why you can have a weight, your students on an overall can be a weighted index of 1.7, 1.9. And that is where you understand. The raw numbers, basic numbers. Remember rule number one, more kids, more money. The weighted reports, more difficult to educate, more funding as well. Now, when it comes to financial governance, this is one of those challenges. Board members, like I said, and superintendents, we all struggle with it. It's a difficult concept of time. But if you understand these things, I think it'll help you really make good decisions as board members and superintendents. First of all, maximize all your funding. Correctly identify all your children, especially these weights. Economically disadvantaged, gifted and talented English learners, they really drive your funding. And if you miss those, they can really impact your funding. Be mindful of average daily membership. That's the number of total kids enrolled, and average daily attendance is the total number of kids in attendance any given day. Has a less of an impact on charters when it comes to finance, but it does impact everybody's chronic absenteeism. Monitor your local revenue and chargeables. Sometimes local tax assessors make mistakes, and the mistakes can be catastrophic. Make sure they're staying steady from year to year. Monitor your grade. Make sure your kids are and make sure those aren't any bubbles from year to year. They should stay pretty steady based on your number of kids. And then, of course, transportation is not a lot of money, but every year you got to make sure all those kids that are eligible to ride a bus can be counted. Plan your expenditures. Think of pots of money. Some things it's not pot in, pot out. You can spend it anywhere you want to. Most of your funding is based on your October reports, and your July allocations are based on your annual statistical report, and your January midterm adjustment is based on your October reports. We have a financial high year in Oklahoma, and that gives you some stability in planning. So that's where you can plan a year ahead if you know things are growing or things are falling down. You're losing students or enrollment. Your majority of your expenses are personnel, and most funds are obligated for the first day of school. That's why it's important to understand that without planning, there's not going to be any changes in your discretionary spending. So if you can understand and remember these 5 simple rules about expenditures and budgeting, plus the revenue rules that I gave you, I think you're going to have a good understanding of school finance. All the weeds and details and complications really will make more sense if you understand those. And I found they help. So whether you're a board member trying to make sure you're asked the right questions, you're a superintendent or administrator trying to make sure, or you're just trying to teach people these concepts, I hope they help. If you have any questions for me, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me, you can text me. I'd love to help you anytime if you have any questions. So thank you for spending this time with me, and God bless.